Hello, this is Aaron with Chiron's Cave, and this is episode 3.
And I'm Susan, um, and glad to be here, glad to be back.
Likewise.
Um, just as a follow up from what we were talking about in our last conversation here, with Chiron and the healing process, I've just been thinking a lot about the relationship of the needed requirement of feeling pain and being in touch with pain in order to start to have some kind of healing process. And that healing in its nature is very much a process, and it does require a space, whether you conceive of it as like a cave or a therapeutic space. I think as astrologers, and for me in particular as an astrologer personally, the need to create the safety and the sense of an alembic or a place that someone can access and feel pain. And I think for my own individual consciousness and, hero's journey with the moon conjoining Uranus, feeling has not always been it has not always felt very safe to be in the emotional landscape. And I think with Chiron, like Liz Green, as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, yeah,
Your moon conjoining in your natal chart,
in my natal
conjoining
chart,
Uranus.
conjoining Uranus, yeah.
Yeah.
And so with the moon, we could talk about the moon a lot, right? And the
Oh, yeah.
nature of anima and what the moon signifies. I think we should talk about that. Maybe not today, but
That's episodes. That's
yeah,
multiple. Yeah, that's a lot of material.
it really
So,
is. Yeah. So I just say that to mention that, I think like we can think of our emotions, but the moon has a dangerous component, right? Hecate, and this idea of the uncertainty of our emotions and the
the waning.
darkness, the waning. Yeah.
That's Hecate. Yeah, the waning moon.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
just
And so,
read that. Selene is the full moon. Artemis is the new moon.
mhm.
Hecate is the waning.
Okay. Yeah. So the dissolution of and kind of the disbursement of energy when the moon is waning, and we're on a waning moon right now, speaking of, with
Yep.
the recent full moon in Sagittarius.
Couple
And
days
yeah,
into it. Yep.
and I think it's really important to mention too, just in terms of today's astrology, obviously the 12th of June 2025, that we are in a Mars square Uranus in our mundane astrology. So I know I'm getting really off track, but Mars squared Uranus can bring up some really unexpected, unpredictable energy. It can feel really volatile. It has a certain kind of maybe like enlightening quality to it. So Uranus, we know, is associated with Prometheus, and so there's just a certain uh, uncertainty in the air, I think. But what I was trying to kind of get to, or as the follow up, is that being in touch with, in order to heal, that the safety and the space and the place of being able to feel pain and be somehow uh, cared for, whether it's self care, caring for ourselves, caring for a client, doing something that's artistic or creative or medicinal. Chiron as the healer and how he healed involved a lot of different forms of knowledge and methodology, but until we can feel the wound or we know what the wound is, we can't start to heal it. So I kind of wanted to mention that. And a lot of times I don't go looking for my wounded places. They come up whether I am looking for them or not. And it's usually the unavoidability of it that requires me to have to either numb it in some way that's going to be potentially destructive, or to face it and look for whatever the remedy is going to be. Right. And I think astrology is a sort of remedy for our pain, but also it's much more than that. But I think in chironic terms, it starts to touch on how can we use the astrology to serve, both our own understanding and also possibly others understanding of what that pain is about and how we can heal.
So something came to my mind when you said how Chiron healed. So I thought, well, he couldn't heal himself.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
this is an interesting point I think with Chiron is that there's healing, helping to heal others,
Yes.
but then also healing the self. And
Yes.
those are two different things, right? I mean,
Right.
they're certainly interlaced,
Mhm.
right? Like that's why, like, if you're, say, a psychotherapist, in your training, you have to go through your own psychotherapy
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
order to be a good psychotherapist. You have to know what that process is like from the other side, right? And
Yes.
so Chiron is the wounded healer, so the healer that heals others, but then could not heal himself. And I
Right. And
think
when I
that's
say, and when,
central.
yes, and I agree. And when I say how he heals, I mean how he
Others,
acted as a healer. Yes.
yes,
But it also, what you're mentioning speaks to the fact that we can't always heal ourselves. And that's just like Chiron couldn't heal himself, but he was able to heal others. And in doing that, is there a kind of healing that occurs for the self, or is there, rather than just a distraction from our own pain, or an attempt to somehow salvage our own a broken state by throwing ourselves into, helpful service to others? Is that a bypassing of an attempt to heal our own pain, or do we need our own kind of chironic experience where, because we can't be our own healers, that's where the astrologer comes into play, or the therapist comes into play? I think about the King of Cups in the Mythic Tarot and Green and Juliet Sherman Burke's tarot. It's, he was able to,
Orpheus.
Orpheus. Yeah. Yeah. And yet there was a certain kind of discomfort with his own emotional pain, that in the signification for the King of Cups in that deck. It's like, but he was uncomfortable with the emotional landscape within himself, and yet he was able to help others in through, music and the capacity for healing in that way. So I think it parallels Chiron a little
Yeah,
bit.
with Eurydice, sure. Yeah, there's definitely a parallel.
Mhm.
Not to barge
Yeah.
in on you,
No,
but
no, please do.
just more on the King of Cups and the Mythic Tarot. Like that's
Yeah.
Orpheus,
Uh-huh.
and also the kings are the cardinal signs. I don't know if that's all tarot, but I know for Mythic Tarot it's true. Like the queens are fixed, the kings are cardinal, the knights are mutable, and the pages are like the element in its purity.
Mhm.
That's how that deck's situated. But with Orpheus or the King of Cups, we're talking about Cancer,
Mhm. Mhm.
which is interesting for a couple of reasons. When you talk about one, Jupiter just entered Cancer and healing, and we were having that discussion, off podcast the other day. So that could definitely tie in there. And then, but also the not sitting well part, I think, is the masculine energy embodied in a king, yet in a feminine, negative polarity sign that is Cancer, and how, like, that, and talking about, I know they're mentioned in the write up on that card, like how Orpheus can heal others, but not necessarily himself.
Mhm. Yeah.
And this kind of, I'd say that's similar with, I think, what you're pointing out with Chiron, or what we're kind of dancing around with Chiron and healing himself versus others.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it makes something that we engage with that is supportive and has true knowledge of healing and healing arts, healing medicines. It makes it symbolically, to me, more significant, because yes, we're all on our own, to be kind of cliche, healing journey, but we don't do it alone, and we it's better if we don't try to do it alone. And as messy as emotions can be, as complicated and confusing as the moon can be, whether it's through the moon card, or, that there is this need for counsel. And I just think, in terms of like the space for that, it's important to mention, because I think, like, it's a process. Healing is a process. We don't wait until, and it's necessary, and I think part of the allure of why people are drawn to astrology and psychology, but that we're looking for answers that we're not going to necessarily find in someone else, but that we might need an intermediary to be able to access parts of ourselves so that we can then feel safe enough to explore or release, or because again, like you said, sometimes it's not about curing or like becoming healed. That isn't the object of it, right? But like we participate in it nonetheless because it's a requirement of the soul in some way. So
Yeah, so I have Demetra George's Ancient Astrology in Theory and Practice,
mm-hmm,
Volume 1,
mm-hmm,
sitting in front of me right now.
mm-hmm.
And there's a quote here, which is at the end of the chapter. It's the end of chapter 1, the hierarchy of the cosmos.
Mm.
And so we're trying to, we're this, I think this segues or ties into what we're talking about because of the negative,
Mm-hmm.
painful,
Mm-hmm.
not fuzzy and soft and rainbow and unicorn
Mm-hmm.
aspect of astrology, new age thought, healing in general.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because there is that tendency to just want to be the fuzzy, what they call it, like the furry rabbit or whatever. I've heard it come up in like occult circles,
Mm-hmm.
speaking like Wiccan and whatnot, about how it's like everything's just all fun and games and it's all about being, but there's like evil, bad shit too.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's like, you know,
Painful. Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's wounds and there's putrid shit and there's stuff that stinks and doesn't smell good and like that we don't want to deal with, but you can't. So the end of this chapter, the hierarchy of the cosmos. I just was going to read this quote,
Yeah,
and
please.
then
Yeah.
we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
And I have plenty more prepared here. So she says, when I use the phrase, quote, good condition, end quote, I mean the conditions that lead to long life, good health, prosperity, happiness, and success in one's endeavors. When I use the phrase, quote, bad condition, end quote, I mean the condition that leads to short life, poor health, poverty, suffering, and failure in one's endeavors. It is based upon the recognition that the human condition is filled with both good and bad experiences, and the astrological chart reflects that reality. Whether or not a person can do something to change the indications of the chart is another discussion altogether that entails beliefs about fate and the efficacy of spiritual practice and free will. But in this work, our lens is what the chart itself indicates about the good and bad of the life of the native based upon the principles of traditional astrology. When using these insights in astrological counseling, you must filter them through your own belief system regarding the roles of human choice, intentionality, and free will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then it's like, let's begin. The first step, like chapter 2, the first steps in learning traditional astrology. Like that was our final, And so I think it's pointing to the fact that, perhaps, your death is in the chart. I don't know where you fall on that. It's like, that's a spectrum. And I'm not saying, because I'm a proponent for free will
Mm-hmm.
and choice,
Mm-hmm.
and that we have those things. But what are we talking about that's in the chart? Like, what are we talking when and I feel like it kind of ties in with what we're talking about with Chiron and the negative part of like pain, because
Mm-hmm.
there's negative, bad things happen, and that too is in astrology, and I feel like we ignore that to our own detriment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And that's interesting, the passage that you read too, because and it's sort of, there's a cut and dryness to the traditional approach where benefic means good and malefic means bad. And the clarification that she's kind of giving out of the gate, right, about the fact that she does mean good in the sense of, those, the criteria that you listed, and she does sort of mean bad, and the negative criteria that follows from that, from the state of one's nativity when they're born. So if you have Mars in Cancer or Mars in Fall, that might look a particular way. It you know there might be circumstances or experiences that are not conducive to what Mars wants to do for you in your life, if you consider him to be, if you consider that energy to be like a live influencing factor. So there's yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And so how much do we try to work with that or change that? Right, she's saying it's kind of up to the individual, and also how much we give it credence. It has to be filtered through our own belief system. Like if I think that if I chant whatever mantra 108 times a day to counteract my fallen Mars, is that gonna, and I don't have a fallen Mars, but just as an example, is that going to change the nature of how Mars functions for me in my chart? you know um so anyway, but yeah, I think it's interesting that George has the she writes the asteroid goddesses. We want to talk about Vesta. I definitely want to get into volume 1 and some of the concepts there. I know you have been studying that too, and you have maybe some. Do you want to kind of go in that direction?
Oh, well, yeah. I wish I was more prepared. In that, I wish that I had gone through these highlights and taken notes to be more, linear in the progression of what we're talking about. Because I feel like
Yeah.
we may kind of bounce around.
Yeah.
And I also feel like this could be a larger project we're doing.
Yeah.
You know,
Agreed. Uh-huh.
and I mean, this is a 600 page volume 1 is almost 600 pages long.
Yeah, I
And
would love to. I would love it to be a bigger project. So
yeah, so but beforehand, because it is a huge. So when I first, so currently I am on chapter 7. I just stopped at 7, so page 90, 89. When I first started with this about a year ago, I made it to chapter 16, so 209, page 209, and I stopped. Well, what brought me to this was actually volume 2, where she goes into the houses. And at the time when I found this, it was like, okay, I'm very interested. I was trying to figure out, what am I doing with houses? So, and it was in volume 2 where she goes into depth in that. But then when I got volume 2, I was like, well, I can't just start in volume 2. I got to get volume 1. I can't start in volume 2. So I got volume 1, and then I was like, well, I guess I got to start here at the beginning of volume 1. So I started my way in, and then I was like, but once I got in 200 pages, I was like, this is a full in-depth study. I mean, these 2 volumes are based on her teaching at Kepler University over a course of like 10 years. So, and this is like this was her
culmination.
Yeah, and this is the beginning of teaching Hellenistic astrology to the modern astrologer,
Right.
because you gotta figure Project Hindsight, right? So you start that in the 90s, early 90s, with Project Hindsight, where they're taking these ancient documents that are Latin, Greek, and translating them into English. Well, when you do that, okay, now you have a translation into English, but what does all that mean uh, to people who are versed in astrology, but they're not PhDs in astrology. They don't speak Latin. They don't speak Greek. So then all these translations start coming out around the turn of the millennium. It was around this millennia, like around 2000. So it's not until around 2010, really, where you have Kepler College now is like teaching this stuff. And she even mentions, I think, that they didn't even have a place for her to teach the ancient astrology, the Hellenistic astrology yet. When they first started, she had to segue into a Vedic class to start with this stuff. And that's like late 2000s. So then it's really 2020 when this starts hitting. So now we have ancient astrology. Now it's all been translated. It's been sifted through by practicing astrologers who are at the forefront of teaching astrology in general to the modern mind,
Mm-hmm.
who have gone through all this stuff and taught it and figured out how to teach it and how to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like the only people who know Hellenistic astrology well are the ones who are teaching it for the most part, because like there hasn't been time for, there's been 5 years for people like me to be like, well, I'm gonna learn Hellenistic astrology with studying these 2 volumes that are available. And then of course uh, Chris Brennan's book on Hellenistic uh, astrology is available,
which is interesting because he was one of Demetra George's first students at Kepler. Yeah. So that's how and when he came into the fold, and where he ended up placed in his contribution at the forefront. Although he is a fairly young astrologer by that definition, right? So
right.
Yeah,
he's our generation basically. He's probably in his late 30s, early 40s. I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's right.
So right around where we're at. So I guess what I'm saying about that is what happened with me is like, okay, I'm still learning astrology in general. I started with psychological astrology, and the house thing got me. I bit into it and I couldn't let go. And I'm trying to figure out, what am I doing with the houses? I need to know everything there is out there to know about it. And then I found myself in this volume 1 of this Hellenistic astrology. And I was just like, wait a minute, I'm not trying to just do this right now. It's a lot. And so I quit reading it to go on to, because I wasn't really quite ready for that yet.
Yeah.
And I already have noticed now, since I started reading it now, I'm on page 80, and it was like one day I read, because I had read it all already. And I know now it is making a lot more sense to me, because I have gone and I've read like Campion's 2-volume history. I've read 30 or 40 books since then on astrology, right? So like now I'm a lot more versed, and now this stuff's making a lot more sense to me. And now I'm like, okay, I can incorporate this now. And so the point is, and she mentions it kind of at the end of that paragraph, like how much of this you use. She's mentioned it a couple times up to this point in the book. Like how much of this you use in your practice is up to you. But it's like, it's important that we know it. Not necessarily that we agree with it, or that we use all the technique, or that we teach just Hellenistic or just use Hellenistic astrology, but it's important that we know it, because the fact is, this is where modern astrology came from.
Right.
Full stop.
Right. So at the very, very least, the historical context is crucial to understand, and to even, with the techniques in it, whether you use them or not, to understand that what you're doing is somewhat of a derivative, inevitably, from this foundational text. I wanted to mention along that line very quickly that, I had speaking of, she mentions zodiacal releasing in here. And in 2018, not long after I had my second daughter, I just got like impassioned again with astrology. And it was in that passion for and finding Hellenistic and being open to the concepts, because I had been modern psychological, like so many other astrologers, since I started practicing professionally. So, but when I became really impassioned with it, that was 2018. And right at that time, I had a loosing of the bond in the part of spirit. So in kind of what that means, and how I interpreted it at the time, was I had a huge directional shift professionally, and that made me feel really good and excited about going in that direction and integrating it, not just full stop. And like she mentions also, I think in the introduction, it's not about like abandoning everything that you've known, but integrate this in the way that makes sense to you as an astrologer. And just to your point, and that felt like a very significant kind of shift for me, and it coincided with the astrology. And now here we are. And it's funny because before I even met you back in November, I was like, if there's something I want to be able to get deeper into through explaining, teaching, exploring, volume 1 seems to be the thing. So it's kind of been tied in for me. The foundational concepts underneath it have been tied in for me in a sense intuitively for what it is that directionally where I'm headed. And maybe that's true for any astrologer, because like you said, maybe we're integrating this as a collective and as individual astrologers.
Well, and where I want to be is on the vanguard.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, for me to say that, full disclosure, right? I'm on like year 3 of astrology, but also like 100 books in at this point of
Mm-hmm.
of deep books, not,
Yeah.
the only
Yeah.
book you need to study astrology or
Real
astrology
shit.
for dummies, like actual, like hardcore academic leading, you
Yeah.
know, teachers of astrology who have been leading the vanguard in
Right.
the modern age.
Right.
I mean,
Right. Yeah.
with me, like Rudyard, Dane Rudyard, Stephen Arroyo, Liz Green, Stephen Forrest, and many others. But
Right.
now, especially now, there's more. But those were like the main. So like the teachers that were teaching in the '80s that were teaching humanistic psychological astrology, Howard
Mm-hmm.
Susportis, of
Mm-hmm.
course. Uh, so so it another thing you were talking about your zodiacal releasing. I have not gotten into that stuff. Yeah, I've heard about it. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know much about it. I
Mm-hmm.
know it's Hellenistic technique,
Yeah.
but I don't
Yeah.
really know much about it. I intend to fix that. I'm
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
on the way to fixing that now. Like I'm in this book. I'm gonna keep reading volume 1. I'm not gonna put it down again, and then I'm gonna pick up volume 2, and I'm gonna go through both of them. And
Right.
I'm studying it.
Right.
But you were talking about zodiacal releasing, and some of the things that I paid attention to that I thought was interesting in the preface, which is sort of like a quick little quick autobiography
Mm-hmm.
in the beginning of this book, just talking about her journey. So a few things I thought were really interesting was that she talks about how, and this is Demetra George I'm talking about. She
Mm-hmm.
talks about how when she was like, her first language was Greek because her grandparents came from Greece. And then I guess when she was young, like a toddler, she learned how to speak Greek. And it wasn't until kindergarten where they were like, oh, maybe she needs to learn English. So I thought that was really interesting. And then she says Pluto crossed her ascendant. And that changed. That's when all this changed and severed her from her homeland and from her Greek origins.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And then it wasn't until uh, Pluto hit the Imum Caeli or IC, which maybe it's Coli. The name that's spelled that way in Latin is pronounced Caeli. So other astrologers out there maybe say it different. So IC, whatever. Pluto crosses her IC, and at that point, she says the Pluto transit to my ascendant during my childhood that had severed my connection to my Greek roots moved on to my IC in 1989, bringing me back to the old homeland. And this also coincides in the midst of her Uranus opposition. And so in the midst of my Uranus opposition, my national and international astrological career was launched, and my reputation grew as a modern mythic archetypal astrologer with an inclination towards women's spirituality. And this is in 1992. So then she says, in September of that year, I led my first archetypal astrology / mythology / archaeology tour to Greece. Wow. I just thought that was interesting with Pluto, especially.
Yeah.
Because like I have Pluto brought me to astrology by conjuncting my sun. Like within 10 degrees, it was like within a 10-degree orb when I like woke up to astrology for the first time in my life. So, and then you're having the square. So I thought that was kind of somewhat synchronistic. And then here we are both in this book now.
Yeah, and it's funny, if I trace Pluto back, I think I have done that. Pluto might have been on my ascendant when I found astrology to begin with. So now I'm going to have to track that because Pluto was 22 degrees Libra when I was born, and my Scorpio rising is 27 degrees. So I don't know. I was pretty young, but now I'm going to track that. And I think it's cool because she's still, I think of Hillman's The Soul's Code and the acorn of what is planted when we're so young. The fact that she on a soul level was sort of geared toward doing the work she's doing, being natively Greek, and that being her
Mm-hmm.
first language. I just think of the soul's code with that, and how, in the recent webinar that I did, which I was super excited about because it was going to be on plant signatures in the chart, and based on a lot of research. And she says in the introduction to her book that she has one more medical astrology. She has a big medical astrology project that she hopes to
Yeah.
complete. Which it seems to me that from that webinar was a part of that project, and kind of the comprehensive nature of how she researches and lays these things out, and then sets about to really explore them deeply and create, like long lasting work around it. But what was interesting in that is that in that webinar on the plant signatures, Pallas Athena came out so strongly, and her knowledge and of and her initial asteroid goddesses, which I think I told you I didn't give a whole lot of thought to back in 2010 when I was in England, and back and forth between England and France, and really connected with some of those astrologers that were doing that work. It's like they raved about it, but I wasn't that into the asteroid goddesses at that time for some reason. But anyway, now, full circle. So like you said, in that part that you read on her interest in women's, in women's, I forget the terminology you used, but
Spirituality, I think she said. Women's
okay,
spirituality. Just and
right.
women's astrology. But the asteroid goddesses and like what that
Yeah.
oh
Hmm.
I can go back and tell you that was uh yeah, so launched so in my reputation grew as modern mythic archetypal astrology with an inclination towards women's spirituality.
Yeah. Yeah. And so maybe we can, when we talk about Hestia or Vesta and Pallas Athena, we can talk. I mean, I know that's part of her work too, but yeah, I don't. So as far as, I feel like you were going to say more though a minute ago, and I wanted to give you space to do that.
Okay, yeah. Well, so this may be a little bit of a pivot.
Mm-hmm.
This is another highlight I have. This is
Mm-hmm.
from chapter 3.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and let's see, I'll just read what I have highlighted.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to start a little bit before. So ancient astrologers were certainly cautious of the increasing influence of the monotheistic Christian and Islamic religions and did not want to present an alternate polytheistic pantheon of deities. Or they may have thought that it was more advantageous, both from a scholarly as well as a political standpoint, to position astrology as a science rather than as religion. The exception to this is found in the Hermetic spiritual and magical traditions, an underground stream of astrological transmission where planetary gods were invoked for intercession in human affairs. Now, there's a lot there with my project, well, our project, but like specifically my perspective. A lot of what I'm really interested in is talked about right there. And so, but the point, man, where do I even start with that? And I guess that may be more of a pivot than
No.
from where we were, what we were just talking about, because we were talking about George and her kind of journey and women's spirituality and Pluto.
Yeah. Yeah.
But before that, too, we were talking about Chiron and negative or the negative and smelly things. And so what I think is interesting, but also here, religion comes up,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? To position astrology as a science rather than as religion. So, and then the exception is Hermetic spiritual and magical traditions. So where you're invoking, intercession from the gods with astrology. So I don't know where I'm trying to go there. I
Yeah.
do and I don't. It's like I said, it's
Well,
a big pivot from where we were.
Well, I think the connection that I'm making to what you're saying, I do think they're very related. And I would say the way that I'm connecting that right now is that the engagement with on a whether you call it a magical level, whether it's, but the participation with the gods, or with astrology, or the signifiers of the gods, whether you take that literally or not, that it is suited to a type of mystical process or individual process of engagement that yields that yields action and results that are
what we can do,
right,
right? What
right.
we can do to intercede with the fate aspect of astrology.
Right. And so it's not a religion in the way that it's this flat kind of, again, to go back to dogma, that it doesn't really work in that capacity. It does have a spiritual, with, as far as women's spirituality, the religious component, the goddesses, the gods, the way that we engage, whether we really believe they're literal or not, but that the way that we operate within that is part of the function of what results we're going to get. And, and it seems like, and I don't know, maybe from that passage you read, my question would be, and is that the argument, is that it belongs more as a facet of a mystical tradition?
I feel like if you don't honor that, it's like you take the teeth out of it.
Mm-hmm.
I feel
Mm-hmm.
like.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then also, Athena gives you the bridle that you can put on Pegasus so that you can use Pegasus to get shit done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, comes to my mind.
Can you get
So
can you tell me just like a little bit more about what you mean with
yeah,
that?
so Athena essentially is, well, Pallas is the asteroid, but Athena as the goddess, right, is the goddess of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what is wisdom? I mean, she's the goddess of wisdom, sprung fully armored out of Zeus's head. And so it's also sort of the which kind of also ties, I think, into Vesta a little bit with the uh, immaculate conception idea.
Mm-hmm.
Dionysus too, right? They're both of those the god and goddess. Like Dionysus and Athena are in common that they're born from Zeus. Of course, there
Uh-oh, I
was.
lost you for a second. You froze. You froze.
Oh no,
It might be me. I think it might be me.
no. Can you
Okay.
hear me now?
It's I can. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah. I got a signal about it. Was probably
Okay.
the internet.
Uh-oh.
Where did you lose me at?
You said that it ties in with Dionysus and sort of the Immaculate Conception myth.
Yeah, whereas Athena was born from Zeus's head, but she came from his union with Metis. And this is the one case where Zeus was told, I don't remember who told him. I think maybe Apollo. I can't remember how he found out, but he found out that the child of this union was going to supersede him and overtake him.
Mm-hmm.
So he pulled a Kronos, right, and swallowed Metis whole.
Mm-hmm.
But she was pregnant with Athena at the time. So then Athena ends up, Hephaestus, Zeus gets a splitting headache, and Hephaestus comes, splits his head open, and out pops Athena. Well, she's wisdom. So I know I'm going on, we're
No.
going into the myth here, but
Yeah, it's good.
I brought up Pegasus, just popped into my mind because we were talking about how you can use like astrology in an electional or magical sense to intercede or to alter potentially bad fate, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's such a philosophical swamp that you end up in, because if you can intercede and change fate, then is it even fate? Like,
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah.
trying to go there right now because that's a huge topic, but it's also a central one when you're talking about astrology.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess we're in the beginning stages of this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And what are we talking about? Like, what are we trying to do? And I don't know. That's still on my mind as far as the audience is concerned.
Right.
Who are we, and what are we trying to say? What are we trying to do? What is our overall project?
Yeah.
So since I'm just bouncing around all over the place,
Yeah.
I'm gonna read one more quote because we were talking about Ptolemy,
Yeah.
and so
Do
this
it.
one, I found it very interesting.
Mhm.
She says, this is George again in the introduction.
Mhm.
She says, ironically, Ptolemy himself, a Roman citizen born in Egypt, may not have been a practicing astrologer, but rather an academic who was more concerned with making astrology conceptually consistent within the context of his cosmological model. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, in other words, you wouldn't have gone in 150 AD or whatever the exact dates when Ptolemy was doing his thing.
Mhm.
It was around that time, right? You
Mhm.
wouldn't have gone to Ptolemy to get your chart read.
Right. Well,
Yet, he's the biggest influence on classical astrology there is
yeah,
because of the Tetrabiblos.
that makes me think of Nick Campion, right? I'm just
Oh,
saying.
does it?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, in
Why's
terms of
that?
the modern time, because he's such an academic and he's
Mm-hmm.
incredibly interested in the cultural history, the cultural phenomenon of astrology. May or may
Yeah.
not have been a practicing or be a practicing astrologer, but the what he's doing for history in terms of his compilations and his contributions academically to astrology are profoundly significant, and I think will be
Yeah.
in hindsight. So it just makes me
Very
think of that.
influential on me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've read The Great Year and both his 2 volumes on the history, and as well as a handful of other books that he's recently too. So,
Yeah. Yeah. But no, that's very interesting about Ptolemy. And what do you make of it? I mean, what do you think
well,
about that?
I when I saw that, I was just because I've been trying to figure out my place in astrology because I just have the feeling that it's not to be a consulting astrologer,
Hmm. Hmm.
but it's like, then what is it?
Hmm.
What am I doing here? Like,
Hmm.
what is it that, and I have this, and this is just the Aquarian probably
Hmm.
in me, where it's like, I don't want to be a part of any club, but I need to be a part of a club.
Right.
So like I want to be a part of the astrology club, but my uniform has to be different from everybody else's.
Hmm.
I got to have a uniform, but it has to be my own unique uniform.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't know. So it's like I don't even like everybody. Like,
Hmm.
but I know I want to be a part of the group, but I don't
Yeah.
like anybody. It's like it's
But
such a difficult thing to be Aquarian.
and I would say that so many astrologers are incredibly Aquarian and can relate to that and can identify with
Yeah.
that. And that's why it feels like astrology is such a big tent
Oh yeah.
in that way, right? Like that so many of us feel that way, some to greater extents and always in very different ways. And that we do have niche, like if you're called to be an astrologer, it's probably because you have either something to practice or something to contribute, or that there's a reason for that attraction to astrology, and that it's part of the process of figuring that out, and like having the conversations that we're having right now is part of that. And for you and for me, because it's constantly an evolving. And I think I talked to you about this, or that, I think I was talking to my friend Jen, who's an astrologer, yesterday. And I was saying that astrology is, in essence, it is a conversation. It's like one of the workshops that I did for Heaven and Earth workshops, or helped facilitate, where I first heard, Rob Hand and Nick Campion and Liz Green and Bernadette Brady all share their infinite wisdom. It was called Conversations in Astrology. And I do think that astrology is ultimately a conversation that ends up in a lot of great works, but that we have to be having the conversations in order to develop the the discipline. And it's an evolving kind of discipline throughout time and space, as we know. It's not stagnant, it's not stationary. So, anyways, yeah.
Yeah. So with Ptolemy being sort of more of a scientist of astrology, but you also got to consider back then that astronomy and astrology were the same thing.
Hmm.
They
Yeah.
hadn't been separated yet, but at that point Ptolemy is where it started separating. He
Hmm.
started separating the woo out of the astrology in, you know,
Hmm.
the 2nd century AD.
Hmm.
That's when it kind of started. So that's interesting to me because with the other quote I read, the exception to this is found in the Hermetic spiritual and magical traditions. an underground stream of astrological transmission where planetary gods were invoked for intercession in human affairs. But then here's Ptolemy sort of scraping that off and saying, no, we're doing the science, we're doing the astronomy. So then we had, the Roman Empire fell, we had the Dark Ages, the medieval period, and then when we finally started getting Western astrology back, Ptolemy was the Tetrabiblios was like one of the only references for astrology at that time. So he's so influential to what astrology became, and yet wasn't even a consulting astrologer, likely, right? According to what my understanding of what George says here, is that he may not have even been a practicing astrologer. He was like a scientist, but because back then it was still astrology and astronomy were the same thing.
Yeah.
So I relate to that in the Aquarian system of astrology kind of way, where like what I'm so interested in is what can we know? What is true here? Not what is true and not just woo.
Right. But you also mentioned in that quote the power of the hermetic and magical traditions and the religious, in some ways, spiritual nature of what astrology is and can do. So the two are, would you say, interconnected? Do you believe that? I guess, like
Yeah,
intuitively.
because that's the other side of this, right? Is that like here I am, a self-proclaimed Hellenic pagan,
Mm-hmm.
communing with gods and goddesses.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how scientific is that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I'm not doing that in a way where I'm like seeing, you know, beings or
Mm-hmm.
even believing that's the case. Like for me, my relationship to it is a psychological one.
Right.
I believe very firmly that gods didn't die; they just fell back into the psyche,
Right.
and our evolution puts us in different relation now. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, astrology seems to hold the key to all this, and
Mm-hmm.
seems to be central. And whatever the case, I can't leave it alone, and I'm completely obsessed with it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I know I'm close. If I'm not at 100 books yet, I'm pretty close.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's two in the mail right now. I have astrology books pretty much always in the mail on the way here, and I
Right.
read them as they come, and there are
Right.
always more of them coming.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what you were talking about kind of makes me think about in the preface as well for in volume one of Ancient Astrology and Theory and Practice, where she talks about the final and seventh major work that is still ahead of her. And it's a completion of a set of her own translations of the Hermetic medical astrology, Iatro Mathematica, with
Yeah.
accompanying historical texts. And I think this, when she talks about this, it's interesting because it goes into what I think of as being pretty magical. This
Oh
includes a
yeah.
text on the construction of healing amulets based upon the 36 star decans, a catarchic treaty on diagnosing and prognosticating the course of an illness based upon the motion of the moon, and the earliest herbal giving, the zodiacal correspondences for botanical medicinal plants with instructions and timing for the preparation and administration of remedies. That sounds like Chiron. you know, that's
Mm-hmm.
that sounds very, very Chironic, and that this is and then she kind of gives ode to Lady Astrologia.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see that practice, you can see that reverence for the gods in her approach, and the brilliance of her mind and intellect and historical contextualization, but also that union with something mystical, something spiritual at play in that communion or communication with the gods or the greater, planetary spheres, planetary energies. which, you know, I think is all to the good, really, you know, to be really, really general. But yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe we can say a little something about Hestia,
Yeah.
Vesta at this point.
Mm-hmm.
We've been,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know. I have a few thoughts on it. I was kind of meditating on it a little bit today
Okay.
without any books.
Yeah.
I think I
Share.
was driving and I was just like, okay, what do I know about this?
Seems
How
like,
could thinking about this podcast, like what would I say right now
yeah. Yeah.
about it?
Meditation on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would
So,
love to hear.
well, so obviously there's it's Vesta. So Vesta is the Roman Hestia, which is the
Mm-hmm.
Greek.
Mm-hmm.
Same
Yeah.
goddess. Well, maybe not the same goddess, but equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to be the same. I don't know if the Roman version was like straight up, they took it from Greece or from the Greek. Because some of them, I think they did that, and some of them were they already pre-existed, and they just sort of like, oh well, Mars is Aris. These are the same.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know with Hestia and Vesta if that's how it came about, but so there's an association with, at least in the asteroid goddesses, so the astrology of the asteroids and what they mean. There's an association with Vesta with Kundalini.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It's like the symbol holder for Kundalini in astrology, and you're a teacher of it, so that's
Mm-hmm.
sort of interesting to point out. But
Mm-hmm.
what is Hestia? I always like the Greek. I like the Greek better, so I like to refer to the Greek gods and goddesses. That's what I observe for whatever reason. That's just how my proclivity
Mm-hmm.
or preference rather. So for Hestia, for me, is there's the association with the flame, like the internal flame, and so it's like sovereignty, and it's, I feel like also kind of doing the work of your daemon. It's like you're almost a responsibility. Hestia is almost like a responsibility, um, but to further flesh out this archetype, it's also focus. So there's the hearth, which is the word focus, I believe is Latin, and it's like that's the word for hearth, I think. So it's like the central place within, and literally the home, right? Back in the ancient times when we had homes, you had a hearth. That's where the fire was, where you cooked, where you kept warm, where you would be if you were in the house and it's cold outside. You would be there at the hearth. And also, Hestia is, interestingly, the first born, well, first conceived. So Kronos, so Gaia gives birth to Hestia, and then Kronos swallows her. She's the first of the Olympians to be swallowed, right? And then when Zeus, gives the potion to Kronos and causes him to vomit up all the gods, she's the last. So she's the first and the last. So there's this idea with Hestia where she's, in a way, before, like, I think it's true in Greece, before you could even pray to another god or goddess, like, you had to give Hestia her due. She's first always.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just this idea of
Hmm.
the most important aspect of our being is to relate to uh and give servitude to this sovereignty, which is not servitude, right? So servitude's probably the wrong word, just one that came to my mind. But yeah, so it's just this idea of whatever your flame is inside, nothing, it's sacrosanct. Nothing can get in the way of that. That's Hestia.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing. You can't let anything get in the way of that. And in our modern world, everything wants to get in the way of that.
Right. Yeah.
Everything. Like, Hestia is gone, but she's not. She's inside, and so it's important to recognize and cherish and honor that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I
that's my
love
quick Hestia breakdown.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that was really very well expressed. And I the parallels between the flame, the inner flame, and um that inner, Shakti, the inner feminine energy that's, well, it's embodied by um in a feminine way in the Kundalini yoga tradition, but as we've talked about, it's throughout a lot of different traditions, that life force energy, and it's sacred, and it's not expressively sexual, but it is tied in. It can be channeled in that direction, but it is in essence the central kind of fire that sits at the base of the spine, and then as it is awakened and disciplined and channeled, it raises through the central channel and the different layers and areas of consciousness or energy centers in the body that end up going all the way up and out the crown chakra. So energetically, what that discipline is a cultivation of what they call the Satnam, or the true self, which to me seems very parallel. And I can see why Vesta Hestia has that association, strongly with Kundalini yoga, because it is ultimately cultivating the internal flame of the self. And like you were talking about with home and hearth, there's some confusion with, and I think rightfully so, around the Vestal virgins, this idea of virginity and the virgin, and how that term has changed over time, because there's a purity to of intent, and there's a purity of self, and the sovereignty, like you said, the self sovereignty that that the feminine has in dedication to something spiritual or something higher, that um can't be discarded or abandoned. And whether you're a man or a woman or some, whatever, however you define or identify, it doesn't matter whether or not that's the case. There's something within and within the self that is cultivating maybe that fire of devotion. So yeah.
It's important to note here that there is masculine and feminine.
Yes. Yes.
It's a polarity.
Right. Yes, there is.
It
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily have to mean sexual in that gender sense of penis, vagina,
Mm-hmm.
male, female. And
Mm-hmm.
interesting too with I know Vesta,
Mm-hmm.
the myth behind, we talked about this a little bit. It's a phallus that comes out of a fire
Mm-hmm.
that the king, who I don't know his name, but it's for the Roman version
Mm-hmm.
of Romulus and Remus, the twins.
Mm-hmm.
The king was supposed to have his daughter mate with this phallus that was just emerged out of a fire.
Mm-hmm.
And his daughter refused, but the maidservant agreed to it and mated with this magical phallus in this fire. So there's this in psychology, at least, there's the idea of the masculine feminine.
Mm-hmm.
No, sorry, the feminine masculine.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, that would be the animus, really, right? So the masculine that lives in the feminine. But specifically, also to kind of tie this back to earlier what I was talking about with the Immaculate Conception,
Mm-hmm.
because here you have a proto sort of myth of this
Mm-hmm.
idea of
Mm-hmm.
what is Immaculate Conception, and but it's related to this female goddess figure who has a phallus in a fire. So it's like a female phallus.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was thinking about this today. I was like, what does that mean? And I kind of came to the thought of, okay, well, you think about creativity in the Greek pantheon, it's always Zeus, right? That's what his philandering is all about.
Mm-hmm.
He has so much creative energy. He can't be held down to one Tahara. Like, he's got to go out and but that's not
Create.
about, yeah,
Yeah.
it's not about sex.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's expressed that way in the myth, but it's just about creativity. So, like, what is this female phallus coming out of a fire about? So I just thought, well, okay, is that the female generative, right? Is that the female creative energy? that's kind of, I guess, what I would see it as, right? Because it's not receiving, right?
Right.
It's the giving, and you think masculine, feminine, you think, okay, masculine gives, feminine receives, like
Right.
that, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that this evokes the Empress card for me inevitably in a way too, because even though the Empress is very different than Vesta in characteristic, it's there. A lot of times people feel there is a misunderstanding of the power of the feminine because it is allocated to reception rather than initiation. And
Mm-hmm.
so, but that's a misunderstanding because the feminine is incredibly generative and
Mm-hmm.
nurturing and fecund and all those great words that go with Demeter and the Empress, and um, that energy, it is creative. And so is there a is the phallus in the fire a necessary component of that? Well, maybe psychologically and maybe mythically and symbolically, yeah. But like the only place that power it resides is not phallic. So, and we know that too, right? um,
Right.
but
But it's
yeah,
just, we have to have these symbols,
uh
and to
huh,
be masculine is to not be feminine. So
right,
how are we going to symbolize that? Well, the phallus is
yeah.
masculine, right? I mean, it's like, where does this stuff come from? Like,
Well, yeah,
psychologically, I mean, it comes from the physical.
yeah, and the immaculate conception of sorts that you're like referring to, and that we've seen biblically and Christianity, and it's you know
But you
the
see a twisting there too, though. When you were talking about, if we were talking about virginity and what
hmm
the ancient Greeks meant by, with Hestia
hmm
being, going to Zeus and being like, I'm sovereign. Right?
hmm
I'm not going to mate. No one's mating with me. Right.
yeah,
Well, the Greek version of that is more, I'm going to mate with whoever the fuck I want to mate with, and I'm not going to marry him, and you're not going to tie me down. I'm sovereign. So
hmm hmm
if I want to get it on,
hmm
I'll
yeah,
do that with whoever the fuck I want to do that with.
right,
And,
yeah, right,
that's that. It's
yeah,
not, oh, but see, in the Roman shit too, you see that changing where, like, if if the Vestals were to
uh-huh,
mate, have
uh-huh,
sex before 30, as they're doing their tour as a Vestal priestess, they
right,
would bury them alive.
uh-huh,
That
right.
was the
The trans
penalty.
Yeah, that
Right.
was a huge transgression because their job, their role was to somewhat sacrifice that more traditional life or identity for tending to the Vestal flames, right? In the temples, and
Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, that was a violation of that commitment that they had made.
But what it became throughout time, the twisting, like I said, by the time you get to Christian times,
Mhm.
the Immaculate Conception is more of a, like, I don't know, like, Mary wasn't a harlot idea, right? Like, Jesus couldn't come from something so base as a penis and sex,
Mm-hmm.
animal
Right,
sex.
right,
You know,
or like
it had to be
earthly,
immaculate.
lusty, like lusty kind of union, right?
Yeah, whore. You're a
Right.
whore,
Eh,
if you have sex. That whole idea, like, you're, outside of the marriage, you're just a slut.
yeah, right. So yeah, so for the for the power of the narrative, and that obviously can be debated, but
What do you
yeah.
mean?
Well, I think it would be debatable whether or not she was literally like a lot of Christians would say that it's really sacrilege to say that she wasn't actually a literal virgin, that it was immaculate. There's differing views on that. But
The exoteric,
yeah,
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 literal interpretation.
right,
Right.
exactly. So, but just in terms of what Hestia represents, the paradox there is that she, we think of her as hearth fire and home and family and kind of giving oneself to the family, but the paradoxical part of that is that it is also about individual sovereignty and the dedication to one's true spiritual calling or purpose, and those two might not be the same thing in
Well, that's
today's
where
age.
Hera. Juno comes in with the giving to the family kind of thing too.
Different. Yes. Yeah. That's a really
more
good point.
Juno or Hera than Vesta.
So when we say like home fire, hearth fire, we have to look at what does home mean, because it's the inner space. It's the way that home used to carry what was the centralizing, organizing principle within our psyche. That's, when it was conceived, this idea of her being the tender to the home flame, home didn't have quite the same meaning as it does today, or at least it was more of a physical embodiment of what was organizing, rather than that you take care of the dog, the kids, the dishwasher, the dinner, like what we think of it as today, I think.
Yeah, more the Virgo idea or sixth house idea.
Mm-hmm.
So there is an association too with Hestia with sitting at the table and eating food as a family. That's a very Hestia thing too.
That's right. You were telling me that. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, and I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, because it's there.
I can't really elaborate on it with right now, but I just know that it's true.
There's an association.
Also, yes, with eating as a family together.
Mm-hmm.
Because you would probably think more Demeter.
Right.
With that, because grain, food, nourishing, or even the moon and its nourishing role, which is another aspect all entirely. We could go into how in astrology, how the moon sort of fractures out into the asteroid goddesses in symbolism.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
Because, you have Venus, because the only feminine bodies or feminine planets are Moon, Venus. Everything else is masculine, right? So there's it's lopsided. So that's where the asteroid goddesses came in like 1980. We should say 86 when that was published. And it's like that. It's almost like a corrective in the symbolism of astrology, because now all of a sudden you have the asteroid goddesses, which would be Ceres, Pallas, Hestia, or Ceres, Pallas, Vesta, Juno. And they're like the four angles too.
Interesting.
Yeah, so Pallas would be like the MC. And I believe Hestia would be the IC.
Yeah.
And so there you go. Then again, what is the IC? Well, a lot of what that is home, inner, subjective,
subterranean,
inherited home. And also, there's a lot there in that area between the 4th and 10th. Obviously, there's a lot of contested area for mother, father, and all. There's a lot there, but so I don't know. I feel like maybe that's a good place to stop today.
Yeah, that sounds good.
We're at an hour and 7. We seem to keep going over an hour.
Yeah, we'll pick it up next time then.
Yep. Well, where we're gonna go, you'll know when we show back up next Sunday.
Yeah. There you go.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.